At the start of this month, the U.S. space agency NASA carried out its Artemis II mission, sending a crew around the moon. But that doesn't seem to concern China at all, because it's also getting close to reaching a major milestone in its own lunar program. An important Chinese rocket is getting ready to lift off, and things are starting to move quickly. Earlier this month, the first Long March 10B rolled out from its integration building at the Wenchang commercial space launch site and made its way to Commercial Launch Pad 2. It was carried there on its transporter erector, where it's now going through final checks ahead of a planned launch toward the end of April. What really makes this interesting is what the rocket represents. The Long March 10B is part of China's next-generation Long March 10 family, a series of heavy-lift rockets being developed mainly to support the country's crewed lunar program, with a goal of landing astronauts on the moon around 2030. Based on earlier information, the Long March 10B is expected to be capable of sending about 11,000 kilograms to a 900-kilometer orbit at a 50-degree inclination. It's also part of a broader push by China's main space contractor, CASC, to develop reusable launch vehicles. The idea is to increase how often they can launch, carry more mass to orbit, and support more ambitious missions in the years ahead. The full Long March 10 system will go even further. It's designed as a common core booster that can launch both crewed spacecraft and lunar lander components separately before sending them toward the moon. While the 10B itself isn't the main rocket for lunar missions, that role belongs to the larger multi-core Long March 10 or 10A versions, it still plays a key part. It shares the same core technologies, including engines like the YF-100 series, along with recovery systems and overall design heritage. So even though this particular launch isn't a moon mission, it's still a big step forward. It helps China refine the reusable technologies and launch systems that will eventually support both commercial flights and future lunar exploration. Not long after arriving at the pad, the team carried out a full wet dress rehearsal of the countdown. That means both the first and second stages were fully loaded with propellant, simulating real launch conditions. This test was especially important because it confirmed that rocket-grade kerosene, liquid methane, and liquid oxygen could all be loaded safely together, something that had only been tested separately in previous months. In the end, the rehearsal went smoothly and was considered a success. One thing that didn't happen at the launch pad was a static fire, and that's actually not unusual in this case. Engineers didn't need to run one because the Long March 10 program had already completed 2 major static fire tests back in August and September 2025. Those tests used a full-scale test article equipped with 7 YF-100K engines, effectively validating the core propulsion system ahead of time. And since the Long March 10B uses the same first-stage design as other variants in the family, like the Long March 10A and the main lunar configuration, it can rely on that earlier data instead of repeating the test at the pad. After wrapping up the wet dress rehearsal, the rocket didn't stay on the pad for long. The Long March 10B was rolled back to the integration building, which might seem like a step backward, but it's actually part of the normal flow. The most likely reason is payload integration. Unlike some rockets, this vehicle can't have its payload installed while sitting on the pad, and it would be too risky to attach it before testing in case something went wrong. So bringing it back allows teams to safely mount the payload in a controlled environment before rollout for launch. At the same time, preparations for liftoff continued behind the scenes. Hazard notices were issued for a launch window between April 28th and April 30th, with the trajectory heading southeast from the Wenchang commercial launch site. What's especially interesting is the size and location of the downrange hazard zone, about 550 kilometers away, which is noticeably closer than what you'd expect for a fully expendable rocket. That detail strongly suggests the first stage booster is intended to be recovered, marking another step toward China's push for reusable launch systems. Oh, and one more thing that's easy to miss, but actually really important. A key piece of hardware expected to be in the hazard zone during launch is China's autonomous booster-catching ship, Linghangze. This vessel could end up playing a huge role in China's future launch operations, including missions to the moon. Earlier this year, on February 11th, the ship took part in a recovery simulation using a Long March 10A test booster. The test used a net-based recovery mode, where the rocket descended toward a mock splashdown point near the vessel. The goal was to evaluate how well the rocket and ship could coordinate during the final phase of recovery, and to give engineers valuable data ahead of real-world attempts. Right now, Linghangze is stationed near Shantou in Guangdong Province, waiting for its potential role in the upcoming launch. If everything goes as planned, the Long March 10B mission could become a major milestone. It would mark the first time the China Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology attempts to recover a stage from a partially reusable rocket, and only the third such attempt in the country overall. If the booster is successfully caught by Linghangze, it'll be a big moment. Engineers will be looking closely at how the stage handled the stresses of flight and recovery, which systems performed as expected, and where improvements are needed. It's exactly the kind of step-by-step progress required to make reusable rockets and future lunar missions a reality. As you can see, even as NASA continues pushing forward with its own lunar missions, China is advancing its space program with a very clear and determined focus. Both the United States and China are targeting the Moon's South Pole, a region believed to contain valuable resources like frozen water, hydrogen, and helium, materials that could support long-term human presence and even be used for fuel. Both nations are also exploring the idea of building nuclear-powered bases on the Moon, which could serve as launch points for deeper space missions. This really is a new frontier, and whichever country establishes a sustained presence first could play a major role in shaping how that environment is used in the future. NASA's effort, known as the Artemis program, has made meaningful progress but hasn't been without challenges. The agency is aiming to land astronauts on the Moon by 2028, which would put it about 2 years ahead of China's current target. However, even NASA officials acknowledge that this timeline is tight. Delays in key systems, from landers to spacesuits, have added pressure to an already complex mission architecture. Artemis relies heavily on multiple launches, in-orbit refueling, and coordination between different vehicles, making it far more intricate than the Apollo missions of the 1960s and 70s. China, on the other hand, is approaching its lunar ambitions in a more streamlined way. One of its biggest advantages is centralized control, which allows long-term planning and stable funding over decades. That consistency has already enabled China to achieve milestones that others haven't. For example, it became the only nation to land and return samples from the far side of the Moon with the Chang'e mission, a region that always faces away from Earth and presents unique communication challenges. Building on that success, China is preparing for the Chang'e 7 mission, which will explore the Moon's south pole and help identify suitable locations for future bases. Another factor working in China's favor is that its initial crewed missions are somewhat less complex. Rather than going straight to the South Pole, Chinese astronauts are expected to land on the near side of the Moon, the same general region where Apollo 11 took place. That area is easier to access and maintain communication with, making it a practical first step. This doesn't mean China lacks ambition. It simply reflects a phased approach, building capabilities step by step. And unlike the Cold War-era space race, China doesn't officially frame this effort as a competition. Its mission cadence has been planned years in advance and continues largely independent of NASA's timeline. At the center of China's lunar plans is the Long March 10 rocket. This is a heavy-lift launch vehicle designed specifically for crewed lunar missions. Standing roughly as tall as a 30-story building, it uses a powerful first stage equipped with 7 engines. Early testing has already demonstrated key capabilities. In initial ground tests, the engines were fired while the rocket was secured in place to validate thrust and stability. Then, in February, engineers conducted a more dynamic test by firing 5 of the 7 engines and launching the first stage to an altitude of just over 65 miles. After reaching that height, the stage splashed down in the ocean and was successfully recovered, providing valuable data for future reuse and refinement. For transporting astronauts, China is developing the Mingzhou spacecraft, also known as Dreamboat. This next-generation spacecraft can carry up to 7 astronauts and is designed for both lunar missions and trips to China's space station, which orbits about 280 miles above Earth. The mission architecture involves launching the crew aboard Mingzhou into orbit, where it will later rendezvous with a separate lunar lander. From there, astronauts will transfer to the lander and descend to the moon's surface. This two-launch strategy is necessary because China does not yet have a single rocket capable of sending both the crew and the lander together. China plans to test Mingzhou's ability to dock and rendezvous with its space station later this year, although similar operations have already been demonstrated through robotic lunar missions. The spacecraft has also passed a critical safety milestone. In February, it successfully completed an abort test, detaching from its rocket during the most stressful phase of launch, when aerodynamic forces are at their peak. This test confirmed that astronauts would be able to escape safely in the event of an emergency. Meanwhile, NASA's Orion spacecraft is further along in its development timeline. First tested in 2014, Orion has already completed multiple missions and recently carried astronauts on Artemis II, a crewed lunar flyby. During that mission, NASA focused on testing life support systems, environmental controls, and overall spacecraft performance in deep space conditions. When it comes to landing on the moon, both countries are taking very different approaches. China is developing its own lander, called Lanyu Lunar Lander, or Embracing the Moon. This vehicle is designed to serve multiple roles. It will transport astronauts from lunar orbit to the surface, act as a temporary habitat and power source, and then launch again to return the crew to orbit. Prototypes have already been tested on terrain designed to simulate the moon's uneven, cratered surface. NASA, by contrast, is relying on commercial partners to develop its lunar landers. SpaceX is building a modified version of Starship for lunar landings, while Blue Origin is developing an alternative system. NASA's plan is to proceed with whichever lander is ready first for the Artemis II mission, which will test landing operations closer to Earth before committing to a full lunar mission. Spacesuits are another essential component, and another area where timelines are tight. China is working on a new suit called the Wenchang spacesuit, meaning gazing into the cosmos. These suits are designed to be lighter and more flexible than those currently used on China's space station. They will include features like anti-glare visors, dual helmet-mounted cameras, and a control console on the chest. Interestingly, the design also incorporates elements inspired by traditional armor, giving astronauts a more visually striking and imposing appearance. More testing of these suits is expected in the near future. NASA's next-generation suits are being developed with help from private industry and are designed to support longer, more flexible spacewalks, up to 8 hours at a time. However, progress has not been smooth. A report from NASA's Office of Inspector General raised concerns about delays, suggesting that readiness for a crewed moon landing could slip to 2031, 3 years later than the current goal. Despite this, NASA leadership remains confident. The agency expects astronauts to wear suits developed by Axiom Space when they return to the lunar surface.